I think we both perceive a combination of malaise and possibly rage, certainly frustration, anguish, angst in the political environment. And while we don't know, you and I were speaking on October 17th, we obviously don't know the outcome of the election yet, but we know to a certain extent the outcome of the campaign, because the campaign, as opposed to the voting, is been 98.5%, 98% over. And we know it's kind of like a litmus test for the political environment. My sense is it ain't good. The image that comes to mind in Walker, first of all, the phrase that comes to mind, Walker Percy's novel, Love in the Ruins. And in it, he makes a reference to alcohol as the sunset gun. And it's as in it's 5 o'clock and she's already firing the sunset gun. And it seems to me that when you look at the deaths of despair that Susan Case and Angus Deaton have tracked among working class white males, if you look at now increasing overdose rates in Black communities, what comes to mind is a sort of growing what I sense is a kind of growing sunset mood that may have been, if anything, exacerbated by this campaign, with some exceptions we can get to in a little while. But what also came to mind was a study that was published in 2018, a political science study. And, some of those are good, some of those not so good. But this one I thought was interesting. They used that enormous database of OECD countries as a survey point, so a large sample. And as the authors put it, growing numbers of marginalized people in developed countries felt what they called extreme discontent, quote unquote, with disliked elites, quote unquote, and were spreading fake news knowingly in their survey as opposed to accidentally, for reasons they described in rather striking terms, to quote unquote unleash chaos, to burn down the entire, these are their words, the entire established political order, end quote, and quote, to disrupt the entire democratic cosmos and start anew. Pretty startling words from academics, and yet they come to mind again during this election. I mean, I think some Democrats, many Democrats, certainly felt a sense of euphoria at being free of Joe Biden, and in Kamala Harris injecting new energy into their campaign. And I got that, but I still think there's a division fueled by emotion underlying all of this. It doesn't break down neatly into what we normally talk about as left-right splits. That's my take on what the campaign's brought out in this, but what's yours?
Well, I agree with much of it, and particularly that it doesn't break down neatly into the left-right. Here are the things that I notice that fit in with what you're getting at. I have a sense of an overarching gloom and doom, for lack of a better phrase. People seem genuinely disaffected, disconnected, disgusted, and fearful of that we are somehow, without being able to give it much concrete shape or form, we're heading into bad times. We're heading into grim realities that we're going to have to live with, face up to, encounter. And it's bad. Before Kamala Harris entered, it was epitomized, I think, by a sense that these two old white men are not relevant to most of us for one reason or another. Then it was, even when she came in, she got a bit of a boost because at least she isn't an old white man, but she was so careful to be a continuation of Biden and all of that represented, that she took away, in my judgment, whatever boost she might have gotten out of being younger and fresher and more forward looking, et cetera, et cetera. And then the worsening of the Ukraine, because even Americans now, despite the effort of the government and the media, the American people, I think, are beginning to figure out that that war is lost, that that war is going to go like Vietnam and Afghanistan and Iraq and whatever you want to call, however you spin it, the American side is defeated there. They kind of know it. And I think they understand, even if they can't tell you what BRICS stands for, they kind of know that the dominance of the United States, this inheritance of our generation, because it starts really with the end of World War II, when all of the potential competitors are wiped out. Germany, Japan, but also Russia and Britain and France and Germany, Italy, all of it, it's gone. They are no competitors of ours. They can, in fact, they need the US to rebuild. And whereas we come out of the Great Depression, the war put America back to work while it killed off all of our competitors. It was a US capitalist dream. Let me make a stark suggestion. I think people feel in their bones that all of that is over, that we are now at the sunset of this exceptional period. It wasn't the US exceptionalism. It was it's very different. It was the exceptionalism of post-World War II conditions. And those are gone. They're not coming back. We're in a different world. We didn't have nuclear weapons before. We do now. They're widely spread. There's no way back from that. And the dominance of the United States, which anyone in 1946 could have and should have predicted as part of what we could imagine history would do, since it had done that to every other empire that ever graced the earth. Ours would have it too. I think there's a sense that it's all over, that it's all coming to an end. I think there's a sense of foreboding that even the vaunted standard of living here in the United States is also not secure the way people thought it was. So that the exodus of jobs over the last 30 years, bad enough in itself, is worse in the sense that it foreshadows more. That when people give us horrible scenarios about what artificial intelligence is going to do to the next generation of jobs, white-collar jobs, etc., there's this sense of exhaustion for us, of exhaustion for our children, and that the politicians who keep cheerleading are sounding ever more hollow when they do it.
That's really interesting. And I think there's a lot of truth to it. But I would make some qualifications, and we'll see what you think, which is we have, and I think maybe this helps us explore the real divisions as opposed to the perceived divisions of this country. We have at least, generally speaking, three segments or three, I don't want to call them classes, but you could, in this country. We have the absolute elites, the 1%, half of 1%, tenth of 1%, whatever you want to call them, who largely finance these elections and so on, and control the economy as CEOs and investors and so on. Then we have the professional managerial elite, 10, 20% of the population, largely Democratic, I think, and that's what I've seen. Then we have working people, for lack of a better term, everybody else. And I think working people is a good term. And I think among working people, the 80% or so, I think you're right. I think there is this sense of foreboding, of anxiety, of anger, of depression. And I think the absolute elites are living in their own bubble. But then you have this sort of 20%, which has become the new Democratic base, college graduate and so on. I mean, they still got a lot of non-college graduates, but influential within the Democratic Party that to me I might characterize them as whistling past the graveyard. A lot of them know and have known what climate change is going to do to this world and to this country. They know about inequality, but like a lot of people in this world, they look for heroes, saviors, easy solutions. So they're trying not to look too closely at what, and I don't want to be harsh on them. I mean, they're people like the rest of us, but a lot of them may be pinning unrealistic hopes on the outcome of this election. And then the rest of working people, whether they're voting Democratic, Republican, staying at home, I think they fit perfectly into what you described and what these Democratic, or rather these political scientists describe about loathing for the Democratic cosmos. I think they have an F them all kind of attitude towards it. Alienation, you use that word. It's the right word. And I think the question is, either way, I mean, one of these two individuals is going to win the election in November, presumably. We may not know until January which one, but one of them will presumably be sworn in as president. But there will be lasting repercussions, I think, from this campaign. And I'm curious. I mean, I'm actually curious to know if Harris loses, will the 20% be disillusioned and shift their thinking? If Trump wins, how will they respond since having talked for so long about how he's a threat to democracy, which I don't necessarily disagree with, but I would have thought if I was facing a threat to democracy, I'd insist on getting out of Gaza, since that's or a ceasefire, because that's so unpopular. But apparently, some things are more important than a threat to democracy. But and then the 80% are going to be like, you know what? They tried to tell. They're going to, maybe some of them will pin their hopes on Trump if he goes in, but it's not going to be that great. Inflation may worsen if your fellow economists' consensus among them is to be believed. So I worry at least as much about the militia types and about irreparable divisions that needn't be along party lines or conservative liberal lines, but have shaped up that way.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very confused. I mean, there's a kind of chickens coming home to rest. You keep telling people, which I believe is a mistake, but you keep telling people for the last 50 years that the West represents quote unquote democracy, that the kind of parliamentary liberal capitalism that is a better descriptor is all going to be wrapped up in a package which we call democracy. Well, when liberal capitalist parliamentarianism is bought and paid for by a very small elite of the top 1%, what's happening is that democracy is getting the blame. Democracy is what's falling short because it was never really democracy. We've never allowed a real democracy to function. Every business has a tiny group of people at the top who are unaccountable to their employees, can hire and fire their employee. The notion of a democracy is ridiculously contradicted by everyday life for the vast majority of people, 5 days out of 7. Democracy is what Bob Dylan had a wonderful line for the old folks' home and the college. That's where you talk a lot about democracy, because it's a wonderful fantasy for people who are not yet engaged in the real world or are retired from it. However you play that, I think there's a danger here that we're going to see a massive disaffection from life as usual. People who used to accept, yes, once a year we go in and we vote, and that's whatever it is, democracy. They're going to see through it. They're going to be done with it, they're not going to want it. Some will go in a direction of looking for a dictator who will save us in this situation of a lost democracy. Others will become revolutionary in a wholly different sense because they'll make a more left-wing sense of it all. However you figure it out, I think you're onto something, because I think the momentous effect of this election will be that it's over, and that now the unresolved, unsolved problems of this society are just going to keep getting worse. You know, Mr. Trump or Kamala Harris, relative to the BRICS and the G7, irrelevant. You know, apparently about the war in Ukraine and Gaza, more or less irrelevant. If I listen to Trump, he'll stop the one in Ukraine and worsen the one in Gaza. I mean, this is all, none of this goes at the issues we're groping to understand in this conversation. A massive experience of a declining empire, a squeezed capitalism, a terrible disappointment with what the political scene is able to deliver, and a sense of the relentless ongoing juggernaut that makes more and more of the middle class disappear in the face of a growing poverty and the playboys at the top.
And one of the things that strikes me about all this, if we look for a moment at the blue side of the ledger, is people who characterize themselves as liberals. Many of them don't, and I hesitate to see this because they're more educated on average and will take offense. I don't mean to be offensive, but I don't think they fully understand the history of the word liberal. So liberal meaning, a believer in individual liberty and in supporting property and individual rights and that sort of thing, being an essential element of it, free enterprise, right? So at least historically. So in that sense, I would argue that recent history has proven that liberal democracy is an oxymoron, that you can't have democracy with capitalism running wild. We've seen that again and again. If Kamala Harris wins and fires Lena Khan, who's at the head of the FTC, has probably done, if people knew about it, the most popular things this administration has done, including just the other day banning, hopefully she'll be able to do it, banning those websites that make it impossible to unsubscribe from a service, things that people care about. Then that will disappoint people. If she wins, she'll appoint Liz Cheney to the cabinet and has accepted warmly the endorsement of Dick Cheney, who, lest we forget, was the most unpopular president or vice president in modern history. 18% approval rating.
Right.
His gag line that I'm embarrassed to say a friend of mine wrote for him was, he said, "I have 18%, George, you have 33%. What's your secret?" So these are not loved people by the masses, for lack of a better word. And adding to that, we have liberal politics of the last 10 years, certainly, that's made an epithet out of populist, which, I'm sure we've talked about this before. Populism is one of the great left traditions of this country and of the world. And so going back to that political science study, if you in effect disdain the will of the people, which manifests in everything from soft banning or shadow banning on, encouraging shadow banning on Facebook to other forms of complaint, you're going to lose them. And it seems to me it's not a given that more Black working people, Latino working people are moving to Trump. It's not a given that this race should even be close, that a person of limited cognitive and moral ability like Donald Trump should even stand on the brink of winning is an astonishing failure on the part of the Democratic Party. To me, I mean, they should be hanging their heads in shame while they're trying to get this thing out of uh, out of the toilet. And so to me, whatever happens, the fact that it was a race is a five-alarm fire for true leftism in this country.
Absolutely. And I think that, let me put it in another way. The more you don't face the level of dysfunction that this society has reached, economically, politically, and so on, the more you encourage the Trump-like character, and the more you encourage, more importantly, desperate political decisions. I mean, let me, and I know we're running out of time, but let me close this point by something concrete. The decision of the United States that it could endorse Ukraine in what they were doing to their ethnic Russian population on the east, in what they were doing in moving NATO up to Russia's border. Forget whether those are real or concocted arguments of Mr. Putin. I don't care about him or about that status of these arguments. But the thought that they could ignore all of that, that they could arm this already dysfunctional society, Ukraine, which already had the reputation, for those who don't know, of the most corrupt political system in all of Europe, to trust them in this sort of a war because you were so convinced, as Mr. Biden told us, that Russia would come to its knees, the ruble would lose all that. This is a colossal mistake. Yes, the war in Ukraine is over. It's won. The Russians won. The U.S. and its Ukrainian flunkies have lost. Horrible damage done to Ukraine. Millions have fled the country and will never go back, etc., etc., etc. But the mistake, look at the mistake. You didn't understand that that wouldn't happen to Russia. You didn't understand that they have a BRICS alliance and that they could sell their oil and gas to India and China, and they didn't need Germany to buy it. I mean, if you had understood that in the end, Russia has experienced more rapid GDP growth per year in the period from October 22 to now than they did before, that the war did for them now what the war, World War II, did for the United States coming out of the Depression, then you would never have done this, be stuck in this dead end, losing another war. That's a sign they don't know what they're doing. And then look at the desperation of the Israelis, slaughtering people on a mass scale with, this is another Holocaust. They're denying it as the one that they suffered was denied by the people they were horrified who were denying it. I mean, these extremes that people have to go through when they're back themselves into an impossible corner, these are signs of a declining civilization, a declining culture. This is Sam Huntington from Harvard, only not like he saw. It wasn't that the great Western civilization was being challenged by something backward. It's the exact opposite. Yeah, there is a civilization clash going on, but it's not so much a different new one as it is a collapse of an old one. It's not even clear yet whether the new will be all that different. Well, they will learn the lessons that we're being forced to live through right now.
And what that brings to mind for me is Mahatma Gandhi's quote when he went to Great Britain, when he went to England, and the reporters asked him, "What do you think of Western civilization?" And he said, "I think it would be a good idea." At this point, in many places around the world, we're seen as the barbarians at the gate, not the other guys, us.
Yes.
And Gaza is a perfect example of that. So, and here, there's popular support for Israel's attack on Gaza, but the unfettered militarism of the support for Ukraine, the sort of reverse McCarthyism of if you criticize the wisdom of that effort. I think these are all warning signs that we need a new alternative populist politics in this country. That's my concluding thought, but what's yours?
My conclusion is don't be only focused on November 5th. Much more important for all of us is how whatever happens then is going to be processed by the different people suffering their way through the decline of the American empire.
We depend on your support here at the Zero Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.